The day after Thanksgiving, and how was your Thanksgiving?
My Thanksgiving was full of thanks. I enjoyed it.
My understanding is, one time I researched the Thanksgiving holiday kind of closely, and in actuality, it's a religious holiday. I understand it's to be Thanksgiving to God.
Well, I would say it has features of both. Obviously, it's a holiday that is found in secular law. It's respected in terms of our secular society, but it obviously has religious undertones based on the pilgrims and their thanking to God for their successful colonization.
And by the way, this is Andrew Greenwell. He's a local attorney in Corpus Christi. He knows a lot about the Catholic faith. There's a little bit of confusion today, and we're still experimenting with our web show, and it's kind of reworked later. But thank you for coming on and kind of bearing with me, Andrew. I do appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So did you go to the Greek festival this year in town?
I did not get to go. I always try to make it, enjoy the food when I go, and I like the cultural aspect of the Greek church, certainly. And so it's kind of fun.
Certainly, it is interesting. And, I kind of thought, I said to some people, I said, well, we need to kind of support the Orthodox Church, I think. You think that's true?
Well, I don't know what you mean by support exactly.
Well,
but I mean, they're a part of the community. Certainly, they should be supported as part of the community. They add a tremendous amount of kind of a cultural richness, and their heritage is something that I think is important. I have a tremendous attachment to the Greek Orthodox Church. For a period of time, actually, I was going to a Greek Orthodox church in college before I became Catholic. I love the Greek fathers. The fathers that wrote in Greek are a very, very important part of Catholic inheritance as well. So, there's a tremendous amount of attachment that I have to them.
Well, what do you think? I mean, aren't they holding the line pretty well on a lot of traditional Christian beliefs, traditional up to 20 years ago? They're holding the line on issues regarding homosexual marriage. They're holding the line on a lot of things that traditional Christian religions have given up on. Isn't that true?
I think that there's some truth to that. I don't think it's monolithic because of the way the church structure is, that they tend to be separated, into different autocephalous churches is what they call them. They're different heads. You got the Russian Orthodox Church. You've got the Greek Orthodox Church. And within the churches, you have groups.
Think of that as a dry run. We didn't go live.
Oh.
We'll be going live here in a second. We're still live on YouTube.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I just didn't press go live. Okay. One more time. 1, 2, 3. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mark DiCarlo. This is Voices of the Coastal Bend. We have to keep this up for 10 seconds to please our public access group. So that's approximately 10 seconds. Tonight, my guest is Andrew Greenwell, and this is the day after Thanksgiving. Thank you, everybody watching. Hopefully somebody's watching it on YouTube, which has been on for a while live, and on Facebook Live. Thank you. Again, that was a brief intro. Again, Andrew Greenwell, local attorney. Think of him as a scholar on Catholic beliefs. He does a lot of Facebook postings the day after Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving was good?
Thanksgiving was great. Wonderful. I enjoyed it very, very much. Family get together.
So that's nice.
Always nice.
And we were, I had asked you in our previous dry run there that was kind of inadvertently cut off that if you had attended the recent Greek Orthodox festival, and you didn't make it, I understand.
I did not make it this year.
Yeah. I tried to make it. I tried to support the Greek Orthodox, even though I'm not Greek Orthodox. Of course, my mother was. And my feeling is they represent a lot that has gone, a lot of traditional Christian values that have disappeared. And they've been very good at holding the line. I don't exactly know why that is. In that regards, traditional Christians obviously were not in favor of same-sex marriage. Traditional Christianity, of course, was not in favor of abortion, etc. And they've held the line very well on that. And I thought it might be good to support them. And I have said, and I don't know if I should say this publicly, I've said to myself, I said, gee, are they the last, are they going to be the last Christian religion?
Well, I think
I might try to adjust this. Go ahead.
That's a little excessive, but I do think that they do hold a line, and they have, especially in the area of liturgy. Their liturgy has not gone through the reforms that the Catholic liturgy suffered after the Second Vatican Council. And they've maintained the traditional liturgy, and they have a strong, and I think it's a very healthy thing, attachment to tradition. And the tradition includes both doctrinal tradition, in other words, teachings about what is true, but also the moral traditions as to what is good. And so they tend to be hold the line when it comes to traditional Catholic or Christian morality, as well as traditional Catholic or Christian belief. So there's a tremendous amount of overlap between Catholicism and Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox beliefs.
Well, when my mother passed away about 2 years ago, I had attended the Greek Orthodox Mass, maybe for the first time in my life, an entire one. And I must say I was very impressed. And I was almost embarrassed in comparison to Catholic liturgy. You know, they acknowledge things that are no longer seem to be acknowledged in Catholicism, whether it's evil spirits or demons or and there's a devoutness, there's a solemnity in their service that we just don't seem to have in Catholicism anymore.
Well, yes and no. I would say that you're right with respect to the sense of mystery that's part of their liturgical celebration. In fact, they call that celebration of the mysteries. I think that the way that they have their church structured, with the altar kind of hidden behind the iconostasis, which is the wall that they have with the icons of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the saints, adds a certain amount of mysteriousness to it. The liturgy itself are very ancient. I don't know which one is practiced here at the Greek Orthodox Church, probably the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. And so they've maintained that. And you're right that I think that the Catholic reforms in the Mass after the Second Vatican Council have removed all that. And in fact, the more you study the difference between the old Latin Mass and the new Mass, it's rather striking and sometimes even shocking how they removed certain aspects of the liturgy, the prayers that refer to hell or the devil or evil spirits or sin or grace. A lot of the references have been dumbed down, and that's one reason why I prefer the old Latin Mass, where those inherited aspects of our prayer have been continued. It's very, very important. There's a saying, lex orandi, lex credendi, which in Latin means the law of prayer is the law of belief. And the way you pray will oftentimes show itself in what you believe. And so with the Second Vatican Council and the modifications in the liturgy, I think there's been it's affected the way a lot of Catholics believe, because the liturgy has been so dumbed down in so many respects, and the sense of mystery is gone, and the priest faces the people, and so it tends to be kind of a communal celebration rather than some sort of act of sacrificial worship of the one true God.
Well, there's a Latin Mass in the city of Corpus Christi. Is that correct?
There is.
And where is that?
It's at St. John the Baptist off of Everhart, close to Yorktown.
Okay. And what time is the Mass?
They have it at 2:30 in the afternoon on Sundays.
And that's the one you attend.
That's the one I attend.
And I periodically attend there. And I'm no expert on the liturgy, and I mentioned this to a priest friend of mine. He said it's in there, but I said, well, I'm no expert again, and I don't study it like anything like you study. I said, well, in the old Mass, in the Latin Mass, the sacrifice was two-way. Christ sacrificed himself for his sins, and you were basically there were a couple of lines in there that you probably know them. I don't. I forget what they were, but in the Latin Mass, it's basically you're giving up your life too.
There's a sense of participating in the actual sacrifice of Christ on the cross, which is what the act of worship is. The Catholic Mass fundamentally is incorporating yourself into the greatest act of worship that man has ever given God, which is Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. It was a perfect act of oblation, of giving of self to the Father. In the Mass, we're able to actually introduce ourselves into that through the ministry of the priest who acts in the name of Christ, so that we actually, it's as if we're present in the very sacrifice of the cross. It makes the sacrifice of the cross in some miraculous way present from the past into the present, and so we're able to participate, and then eventually take communion, which is to a real sacramental participation in the very sacrifice of Jesus on the cross.
I wish I had the access. One day I'll be technological enough to have 3 screens up here instead of 2. But and that's an interesting issue too, which you were discussing. And I've told people this consciousness, and I don't want to put any religion down. I respect all the religions, but this consciousness that you're going to control people or affect them by talking. And the Protestants have some of these magnificent sermons, and they're saying these things to you. But it's not the same as obviously the incarnation of Christ, and it's not the same as much of the unconscious symbolism that you'll see in a Catholic Mass. And this, it's kind of like I had a lot of my my criminal clients now. How did you get there? Well, I made bad choices. Well, they're teaching them this. You make bad choices. But when I hear that, I think it's so ridiculous. You're making bad conscious choices. Like I ever get to the point where I would think of sticking a needle in my arm. I would, whatever, I haven't had a case like this. I would rob an elderly lady. That's not a choice. If they're teaching them, and this is a discussion about talk and instruction. There's something missing if you're reaching the point of thinking about putting a needle in your arm or robbing an elderly lady. And they're trying to teach these things again. And that's my disagreement. And I'm not a great scholar on some of the Protestant religions. I said, you're not going to tell these people and get them to change. There has to be a sacrament. There has to be an incarnation. A friend of mine wanted to go to this Church Unlimited here locally. Have you been out there?
I've driven by it.
Well, he was enthusiastic about it. And they had a very popular thing about football. The minister was dressed in a football uniform and et cetera. I said, well, I thought it, even though I thought a little bit sacrilegious. I says, where's the sacraments? This man is starting a church and he's telling you these things consciously, and you're going to believe it. So those are some of my issues regarding the new Mass, consciousness, true religious beliefs, and as you'd imply, true religious beliefs without evil, without demons.
I think with respect to the phenomenon that you're talking about, number one, there's nothing wrong with reading the scriptures and having somebody elaborate on the scriptures. I mean, that's part of what the Catholic Mass is too. And to that degree, there's nothing wrong with what is being done. Reading of the scripture is a sacred act as part of the Mass. It's God's means of talking to us, of teaching us. The priest elaborates on that, using the wisdom of the church and bringing it all together and so forth. Those things are good, but that's not all that worship is, nor is worship just singing or even praying. For a Catholic, and this is true for the Orthodox as well, any traditional Orthodox church, in other words, a traditional historical church, would have the sacramental aspect of worship, where God, in fact, has combined things of the earth, whether it's bread and wine, or oil, or water, and has interwoven into these matters, into the matter grace. And so we actually, through the sacraments, grace gets given to us in these rites that have been given to us by Christ, at least in its basic form, and then developed by the church. And so the sacramental worship is much deeper. It tends to use the whole human body. The senses participate in it, whether it's incense or whether it's hymns, Gregorian chant, or whether it's the use of water or bread and wine. The senses become incorporated in the act of worship in God, and it becomes more theocentric, I think, than a lot of these modern churches where it's almost entertainment, where the people are being entertained. But that's not at all what worship is supposed to be. Worship is supposed to be focused on God, and as basically giving Him thanks.
We're talking, and not to talk around this subject, I go to church, not me, but a person goes to church. Their priest is involved in a pedophile scandal, heinous acts against children. Where does that put these acts? I think I know what you're going to state, but I mean, where does that take I'm taking communion. I was taking it from a pedophile. What does that say about the church? What does that say about their beliefs? What does it say about the beliefs, Catholic beliefs in general? If we would have a priest that would do something so evil.
Well, it is evil, and it is absolutely in contradiction to everything the church stands for. So the priest who is involved in something like that is in a state of mortal sin and in a horrible breach of trust of the power of his office that has been given to him, which was a gift of God. So it's a tremendous abuse, and it's a horrible, horrible thing. And the psychological effects and spiritual effects of such a thing are horrible, and to be fought against with everything that we have. But the fact that a priest may be in that kind of depraved situation does not affect the validity of the sacraments that he dispenses, because it's not the priest that does it. The priest becomes an instrument, and God can work even through the hands of a priest that's in mortal sin, even one who's depraved, as long as he does the rites of the church. That's the teaching of the church. It's been the teaching of the church forever. At one point in time in the 5th century, there was the Donatist church, and they claimed that the sacraments were only effective if the minister was in a state of grace. Well, that made it impossible for you to know whether the minister was in a state of grace or not. And so the church says, no, that's not how things work. The rites themselves are effective in and of themselves, as long as you have a validly ordained priest. The moral fiber of the priest is not at all indicative of whether the sacrament is effective or not, because it's actually God using the priest as an instrument. He's only an instrumental cause and not the first cause of the actual rites themselves.
Well, I could see that argument stronger when we had a Latin Mass, where the Mass was the same everywhere. It was said in the same language. But now you have a certain cult of personality, I think, within Catholicism too, wherein the priest is trying to attract members, and obviously he could differentiate his church somewhat more by changes in the Mass than other Catholic Masses. And therefore, I'm not so certain that the priest is actually in the same role as he was in the Latin Mass, because now he is more of an entertainer. He is more of a cult of personality, wherein before the priest was actually a very small part in the Latin Mass. Am I characterizing this correctly, or
No,
what do you think of those statements?
I think you're right. I think that the modern Mass, with the priest turned towards the people, has caused some problems, and one of them is that it is this personality issue. In the old Mass, the priest would have his back turned towards the people for at least the actual Mass service itself, and he would become anonymous. Mm-hmm. And so what you would see is his back, and usually there'd be a symbol of Christ on his chasuble. And so it would direct your attention to the fact that this priest is being nothing but a small instrument in the hands of Jesus Christ, that Christ actually is there offering himself back to the Father through the Mass in a sacramental way. And so the priest's role, even though it was very important because it was central, was minimized, and his anonymity was stressed because he was no longer acting as Father James or Father Mike, but he was acting in persona Christi, in the person of Christ. And so he had to minimize himself, like St. John the Baptist says, he had to become lesser so that Christ could become greater. And I think that's been lost in the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. And I think that entertainment has kind of taken charge. And I do think that priests feel forced to have to try to kind of pep things up because of the change in the direction of the Mass and the dynamics.
I see. There's been a recent issue regarding, and I think we discussed it a little bit on Facebook, wherein Pope Francis is stating basically that capital punishment is now inherently, I can't remember his exact wording. What was his exact, do you remember his exact wording? Inherently wrong or something?
No, he didn't go quite to say it's intrinsically evil. He said it's inadmissible. And that word inadmissibility or inadmissible is not a common term in Catholic moral theology. So there's some question as to exactly what it means. But I think there's no question that Pope Francis, by making the change in the catechism from the words that were before tended to want to restrict capital punishment in a firmer way. And some people have interpreted that as saying it's intrinsically evil. Others, I'm among them, would say that there's no way that the Pope could teach that because the received teaching of the Church is that capital punishment under the proper circumstances and with the proper protections and due process concerns and so forth is a morally licit form of punishment, and in some cases maybe even meritorious.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I don't think that the Pope could go so far as to say that it's intrinsically immoral. After all, God himself in the Old Testament provided for death penalty. And so if you're saying that the death penalty is intrinsically evil, then God himself commanded something intrinsically evil in the Old Testament, which is an absurdity.
Let me make a couple points. My understanding is the early church fathers were not by any means uniform on this issue.
I will agree that there is some fuzziness there in the early church. You got to remember that the early church was being persecuted, and so there obviously the death penalty was something serious that they encountered as a course of their martyrdom. But what you see is that as the church, as Christianity becomes a social factor and a factor in civil society, and Christians become have part in government, you see that they have to realize that the state has to have this power under the proper circumstances to exercise as part of their punishment. St. Paul, in the letter to the Romans, talks about how the government has the power of the sword, and it's to be respected. Jesus himself recognized from Pontius Pilate that he had the authority over life and death over him, and never criticized it. So I think even though you do see some of this anti-capital punishment sentiment and even anti-military sentiment as a small part of the tradition, I think the larger bulk of it would be one that recognizes the validity of capital punishment as a legitimate moral way of punishment. Now, that does not mean that you have to always exercise it. And I think that part of the received tradition is also this notion of mercy. And so even though capital punishment may be something that is morally allowed, you may, for the reasons of mercy, not want to implement it. And so there is that aspect of it, which I agree with as well.
Well, I want to say two things. I told a couple of people this, and they kind of agreed. John Paul II basically set this up, I feel, in the catechism, because in the catechism, the recent catechism, what was that referred to as?
Catechism of the Catholic Church.
Okay, okay. because when you're kids, you had a little catechism, right? Okay, so the catechism that came out in the 70s or whenever, Pope John Paul II, when talking about capital punishment, said, well, he said, capital punishment or the death sentence shouldn't be issued unless reform is impossible, and with modern rehabilitation, unless rehabilitation was possible, and in modern rehabilitation methods, it's probably never impossible to reform people. So he's talking about like secular, as far as I can see, rehabilitation. He didn't say by the saving grace of God, the incarnation of Jesus, the spirit and soul of man will be changed. He's talking about, and I'm thinking to myself, he set that up.
What he did, yes.
Did you agree? Or
what he did is in focusing on the issue of capital punishment, he tried to limit its use to kind of a defense, in the sense that you can't use capital punishment so long as you can protect the prison population from this guy, this wrongdoer. So long as you can protect the common good and the population in prison from this man through alternative means, you should not use the death penalty. And as a consequence, he says the death penalty should be rarely, if at all, applied.
Well, that's well stated.
But and I've looked at that. The Pope did not say, Pope John Paul II did not say that the application of the death penalty was intrinsically evil or even evil, but he was just saying that for the purposes of applying mercy in our judgments of criminals, that we should go to the extent that only if the criminal presents a threat to human life, either in the prison population or through escaping, for example, if we don't have proper jails and so forth, then the death penalty is something that can be considered. So I think what he wanted to try to do is to put a level of bias against it, but he never intended to say that it was intrinsically evil. He would not have. And so that's why what Pope Francis did seems to go a step beyond that, and he has been criticized by a number of moral theologians on the grounds that he has overstepped the bounds.
That's all very interesting. So you don't think that my criticism of a saint, God forbid, that my observation that when he's talking about rehabilitation through secular methods of these people who've committed capital murder, that's a little bit questionable coming from the Pope?
I would say this, and you're just taking a narrow sliver of his teaching. And Roman Catholicism believes very, very strongly in both grace and nature. And we have a belief that grace doesn't destroy nature, but grace builds upon nature, grace repairs nature, grace improves nature. And so when you start looking at a person's moral life and their behavior, the first thing you want to focus on is their natural human life, bad decisions, bad habits and so forth. And those can be fixed through different means, but that's not sufficient. So you have to add the other part of the equation, which is grace. And John Paul II certainly talked about grace in other areas. And I think he would expect it to be applied and have a Christian ministry to those people who are in jail.
By the way, as an aside, I wanted to get this in. I never hear it discussed. I was reading, some anthropology book and made an argument that, well, Christ armed himself and armed his men the day they came for him. And the only reason, and that in many respects, Christ really wasn't nearly the pacifist we were told, and that it appeared that the only reason that he armed the men, and there was the ear cut off, and there was a centurion, he told them to cease is because they were outnumbered and would have been useless. I thought that was an interesting perspective.
I've never heard that, but
I don't know.
I think his thinking was this, and that is that he had foreseen his sacrifice on the cross, and that was part of his plan.
That's what we're taught, right?
To incorporate himself into the providential design of God, which was that he would be condemned to death, an innocent man, and that by being obedient to the will of God in a perfect act of obedience, which is what the sacrifice of the cross was, he redeemed all mankind. And so I don't think that Jesus was thinking in practical terms. Look, I don't have the manpower. He even told
he didn't have the manpower.
Pontius Pilate
but that's different than capital punishment
Yes.
issue anyway.
Yes,
I don't know what it's quite a bit different. But and the issue regarding self-defense is, and I think within Catholic thought, self-defense is permitted, right?
Self-defense is permitted.
I mean, it's not
you can use reasonable force to prevent somebody from doing something immoral or harmful to you. When even deadly force and to stop somebody in the right circumstances.
I wanted to discuss something very quickly. I may mention it before on the show because we've talked about the Latin Mass before. I don't want to necessarily sit here and act as if the Novus Ordo didn't have any good points at all. I think it was Carl Jung who said that you were reaching a point in Catholicism wherein those statues, et cetera, weren't really piercing the heart of the person. They really weren't. They weren't alive to us. So it was very objective. So you would have a sermon, you would have statues, but you didn't have the heart and mind of the people involved. And that was one of the reasons for Vatican II. You find any validity in that?
I don't know if I'd quite agree to that. I think, and this is a difficult issue, but I think essentially what happens is that there's almost, and Benedict XVI talked about this, there's almost two councils.
Like we have two popes.
Yeah,
I'm just joking.
It is
terrible.
But you have the actual council itself, and then you have the spirit of the council. And there's actually two schools of thought as to what was intended. And Benedict XVI stressed during his pontificate this thing called the hermeneutic of continuity, or the hermeneutic of reform. And his basic thrust was, look, the Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council, was not some super council that disposed of all the past. But what you have to understand is you have to understand the council within the fact that it's in continuity with everything in the past. If you had that sense in you, I think you would have seen the reforms that were implemented by Pope Paul VI. I'm talking about the liturgical reforms. They would have been different. I think what happened is that a lot of the liberal elements, modernist elements of the church got together and were in the Roman congregations that implemented the council. And as a result, I think you have the new mass with its defects. I mean, there are some benefits that people point to it. There's more scripture that's read. They have a 3-year cycle instead of 1-year cycle like the old church. It's in the language of the people, so they
3-year cycle for
reading the scriptures.
Okay.
You have, the lectionary has three years, A, B, and C, and so more scripture can be read during the course of 3 years than you can during 1 year, because the old cycle was repeated every year.
We used to believe that people didn't understand the scripture anyway, so you got to tell them, right?
Well,
you give them a simplified version, they would listen, right?
I think you can just read it.
You memorize it. You memorize the
Gospels are very easy, simple language. I mean, St. Paul's letters might be a little more difficult, but the Gospels are very, very simple language.
Simple language, but is it simple interpreting them?
Depends. I mean,
when Christ talks about the dead, a lot of times he's not talking about the physical dead, and I think a lot of people don't understand that.
No, and you can always take scripture and you can say what you want it to say, but in terms of it being a depiction, an accurate depiction of Jesus Christ, who he was historically and what his claims were, I think it's pretty clear.
Okay. We've had this, there is a kind of a split too. We've had this great migration coming up from Central America. And then, there's all this, many people argue that it's actually the liberals in the United States that are more Christian than what the traditional whatever religions are. Wherein they are saying welcome these people with open arms, and more conservative people, conservative Catholics, etc., are more who arguably Trump often represents. People think that the Christian base went towards President Trump, that the Catholics and or the traditional Christians have less of a heart than do the secular liberals. Now that's just an opinion, and you may not have an opinion on it. That's kind of, again, you don't know any of the questions. So, but I think it's kind of an interesting dichotomy. I have an opinion on that too, about the illegals coming to the United States, and not being very far removed from legal immigration myself and my grandparents. I have an opinion, but so what are your thoughts on the necessity for Christians to embrace people from South America through this caravan, and are the traditional Christians showing a form of hypocrisy by not apparently embracing them?
I think there's two issues involved, and when you're looking at the situation, what happens is that there's no clear answer. It's going to be an exercise of prudence, and you can have different opinions as to what part of the equation you can stress. I think it's absolutely right that people have a human right to emigrate. Okay? There's no question about that in my mind. That's one of the principles that's valuable. I think it's also very important to have.
What if we were full up?
I haven't told you the other side of the equation. And the other is also to treat people with human respect and human dignity if they are here in the country, even if they're here illegally. But at the same time, the other side of the equation is that there can't be confusion and disorder in our laws, and that we have a right as a nation state, a God-given right as a nation state, to control our borders and to have laws to administer the borders and to make decisions as to who should come in and how. And those people that are coming into our country should respect those. So that's what you're weighing. You're weighing two parts of the equation, and where, between the two extremes you meet, there's room for debate. And so if you tend to land more along the lines of let everybody in, these are all people that have a right to be in, and blah, 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 that's fine. But don't demonize the other side that's saying, no, you got to think about the other aspect of it, which is that we have laws. We have a right to have laws. Laws need to be enforced. That's a very good thing for the common good, for the laws to be enforced, including the immigration laws. And so the two sides shouldn't be demonizing each other. They should be working to try to resolve in a democratic manner the dispute, so that the truth somewhere falls in the middle through some sort of political prudence, where both sides are given voice and both sides, at least to some degree, are respected. The problem with modern politics is that there's such demonization of the other side, and it just squelches cooperation.
I blame that on the Republicans, and I blame it. It started around the time of Karl Rove.
I think it's on both sides.
Well, I think it's on both sides now, but I think they started it. And in all honesty, I've changed. I'm somewhat more conservative than I probably these paradigms are always changing. Liberal, conservative, and all that. It's always changing.
I think you have to go beyond that. I think the left has been infected by Saul Alinsky and their techniques, and his techniques, which they use.
I know. I've heard that condemnation of Hillary Clinton and Saul Alinsky. I do disagree, and I will say this. I thought when Gore and gosh, I forgot his name now, the other candidate against Bush Jr., Gore and Kerry sat there with leads and let themselves be degraded and insulted until their leads were diminished and were not aggressive back. I said, what kind of a party is this? So now, and under Obama, and this just saying this, it doesn't make any difference. I voted for President Obama twice. Very, very disappointed in him. But whatever, you only have two options. They attacked him from day one. From day one, very maliciously. So when President Trump came in, first Republican president I ever voted for, I said, hey, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, man. But you're both playing that. Now I may be incorrect. I'm no I think it's interesting what you're saying about Sullivan Polinsky, which I've heard before. I haven't read his works, and a lot of people say that's who Hillary Clinton is influenced by.
I think she wrote a paper on him. I mean, I think maybe even her dissertation. I can't remember, but yeah, she was influenced by him. I mean, so was President Obama, and he's a fascinating man in his own right. I mean, the guy was a genius in terms of community organization and getting things done. But the techniques he used are sometimes, well, in many ways, unfair, from ridicule and so forth to other means that are difficult. So I think it started with the more left position, and I think that the right wing in defense has responded accordingly, and so it's poisoned. It's poisoned political discourse.
Well, it has, but on many of the issues that Americans are concerned about, militarism overseas, corporatism in the United States, it seems like the Democrats and Republicans are on the same page.
And there's a lot of overlap.
I mean, so this fighting, I almost think of it, they're both corporations. They're just two corporations fighting about money, secular organizations. I don't, now that some of that you probably never heard that argument, but I mean, I don't see much goodness in them. Do you? I mean, I don't see much goodness.
Some people say that the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is how fast you want liberalization to occur, right? So one goes a little more slowly, the other goes a little faster. But they don't, in some areas they have fundamental differences. For example, in abortion, I think the Republican Party
that's a fundamental.
It's pretty strong.
But
in practice they have.
When they had the opportunity to get rid of it, they had the Senate, the Congress, the presidency. There was no attempt to pass any legislation forbidding it, right?
Well, there's been efforts to try to do that.
There's been a lot of cases brought before the Supreme Court.
The first thing you have to do is you have to get Roe versus Wade reversed. Otherwise, you can't pass laws. As long as Roe v. Wade is there, you can't pass laws prohibiting abortion. I mean, there's some ways that you can limit it, based on for medical reasons and so forth. And I mean, the test gets kind of complicated and it's evolved over the years. But fundamentally, as long as Roe v. Wade is the law of the land, you're not going to be able to pass an absolute prescription.
I guess I haven't read. I did read Roe v. Wade one time, some years ago, and I'm not well enough versed right now to state why I believe it can be reversed through legislation. I do remember thinking that it was very almost ridiculous, stating that the primary reason for making abortion illegal was because it had to do with the right of privacy between a woman and her doctor, and then it's never her doctor performing it. It's some other doctor. So
the whole thing was kind of, they say it's a exercise raw judicial power, right? I mean, there really was no constitutionally recognized right. It's legal fiction. Is what the whole case revolves around, and it was result oriented. Yes, I mean,
we have these decisions on the right and on the left, don't we? We have these sort of legal fictions on the right, on the left. On the right, on the left, recently you also had homosexual marriage approved in every state in the union, overriding 2/3 of the state's laws in a similar manner too. And then we also have it regarding these issues regarding Citizens United decisions on the right, et cetera, wherein corporations are allowed to give unlimited amounts of money to political candidates, and then the more recent one, the governor of Virginia, was could be in fact kind of paid off by lobbyists through ingratiation and access. So you have the Supreme Court enacting in both ways, in almost illegal manner. Well, is that right?
I don't know if I'd say that.
Well, we're lawyers. We're not supposed to say that. If I say it,
I think this is
someday it's going to.
This is where I think it's different. I mean, you are going to have bias. I mean, people have, even judges, when they take the office, they have certain. We
have a judge watching the show right now, so thanks for watching too, Judge.
But so where was I going with this? But I think if you're a strict constructionist, you tend to be you tend to have limits on yourself. In other words, your jurisprudence is by definition going to be limited to the text of the Constitution as understood by the ratifiers. And so your freedom of movement, as long as you're intellectually honest, is going to be constrained. All right. Now, if you believe in the Constitution as being kind of organic, evolving structure, and you're not wed to the text of the Constitution, you have a lot more freedom. And so you tend there tends to be a misuse of it because of the fundamental jurisprudence theory that you have allows you, you're not shackled in any way. Now, I think a conservative jurist is shackled by the word of the law, by the word of the statute, or by the word of the Constitution. I think that there's some.
I'm going to say, go ahead.
I think there's something real valid about that. And
there's nothing in the Constitution. All they do is they set up the Congress, they set up the Supreme Court, they set up the Senate.
But the Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights was added afterwards, and that could be changed.
Yes.
People talk, the Constitution. Well, they had a prohibition against alcohol. They put it in there, they took it out.
But then that's part of the Constitution. The Bill of Rights is part of it.
Well, but that could be changed by, what is it, 2/3 majority?
Sure. And that's
well, but I mean, when people talk about this
process
Constitution, like it's the Constitution itself, there's hardly anything in it, except the only thing I know in it that has anything important to do is that your right to writ of habeas corpus. And then the rest, they just said, isn't that right?
Well, I mean, I think the Constitution sets up the branches of
right,
government.
Right, sets up the branch of government, mentions the right of habeas corpus.
But
all the rest is in the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, well, the Bill of Rights is part of the Constitution.
It isn't. We get rid of those at any time. We can repeal any of those.
But you could
repeal any of those due process, law.
You can repeal Article 1 and Article 2 and Article 3 too of the Constitution. There's no part of the Constitution.
You have had a constitutional convention to change the Constitution itself, don't you? Is that incorrect?
I think the same process for both.
Well, I don't think so. But we're not constitutional scholars.
No,
pardon me?
I'm not.
Well, are you licensed up there? You're licensed up in the Supreme Court?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm licensed, but you had any cases up there?
I've filed several petitions for writ of certiorari. They've all been denied.
It's
pretty hard.
I filed one or two. Well, my understanding is, you want to hear another negative thing? Because when I was doing one of my cases,
do I have a choice?
Yeah, no, you know, this is my voice right now, not yours. Okay. Unfortunately, because I'm a lawyer, I'll talk too much when we're talking law. So I had this writ up there, and one of these obscure constitutional lawyers calls me up. I've seen him in Houston. They'll practice by themselves, and that's all they do. They don't have secretaries. Mm-hmm. He says he was very complimentary in some respects. I don't even remember all the lingo because I haven't done one in so long. He said they're looking at it for a long time. He said they might actually hear this case that I had, you know. And what was revealed to me by him is, he said, ordinarily, they look very closely at the American Civil Liberties Union's cases. In other words, these large institutions in that have larger, including the the ACLU, have much wider, they have much wider reception by the Supreme Court than your local street attorney, Mark DiCarlo. So I thought I didn't know that. I mean, perhaps I should have in the world of realities. So we're not going to be able to, I don't think the people have a voice before the Supreme Court in the same manner they think they do if the United States Supreme Court is giving preference to such agencies as the American Civil Liberties Union.
You know, they formulate their judgment, and I would think that one of the things they look at is who the lawyers are. And why they're involved in the cause. And so, yes, I would think that you are at a disadvantage. Andrew Greenwell or Mark DiCarlo filing a petition for writ of certiorari is probably at a slight disadvantage, you know, but that doesn't mean that you can't get heard. But yes, obviously the court has very limited resources in terms of time and in terms of how many cases it can dispose of. And so it has to guard, the cases that get past its threshold pretty jealously. So that's
party line. He's saying the party line, ladies. I'm just teasing you.
It's true. You only have nine justices with their staff. I mean,
by the way, since we began talking about Catholicism, that's in Christianity mostly what I wanted to speak about. But did you ever read the series of decisions which basically made it very difficult for the funding of parochial schools. There's a whole series of them.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, they did that. That was very sly. They said, well, no, you can't deduct. You can't deduct, for example, like let's say that you were paying for your children to go to a parochial school. They said, no, you can't deduct it. They said, well, 3/4 you can't deduct it from your income tax. Well, 90% of it. What about the 90% that has nothing to do with religion? No, you can't deduct that. There's actually a whole series of cases that practically were very adverse to Catholic and parochial schools, and for whatever reason, that's not often discussed. And that has to do with the funding too, where they tried to get the funding, similar funding to what the public schools received, but and then they tried to get it for like 90%, the 90% that is non-religious, and that wasn't permitted. So there's a whole series of cases, which I think was to our United States detriment. I've been to public schools and I've been to private, and I've always been much happier myself with the private education I received.
There tends to be a kind of a tendency towards a monopoly in our state system of schools, our public school system, and they obviously want to protect that. And so you have problems with, deducting parochial school payments or private school payments. You have problems with governmental funding of that respect, and
that's what these cases came through. Well, in one of the problems that I've had, just talking again about my opinion, is in public school, religion is like illegal. I mean, how can something? It's illegal to talk about it. It's illegal to discuss it. And then many of
my son came back one time and said that they can't even discuss Aristotle and Plato because
Plato originated the origin of the concept of one God.
Yes, because they believed in a God, and therefore these pagan philosophers you can't even discuss, which is crazy. I mean, you're limiting somebody's education.
Well, what about the history? When you were reading world history, did you ever read about Emperor Constantine? I don't think it was mentioned. Is it?
I don't remember. I don't think.
I think it's impliedly censored. Perhaps one of the greatest events, one of the largest events of the world, when the Roman Empire became a Catholic and the empire was moved to Constantinople, and there was an apparent attempt to unite East and West. Unless you read it on your own, you're not going to learn it. So I don't know about secular education, though there is this movement towards home study, etc. We have been talking about this migration. I think the Catholics. I have heard people condemn the Catholic Church, saying, "Well, they're behind it because they want more Catholic members in the United States." Have you ever heard that?
I've heard the argument. It's a little simplistic. I mean, I think that again,
and that's why they help them to get more Catholics over here.
I think. I mean, that's part of this demonization of the other side. I think that we should consider that the people that are taking that position are sincere in their beliefs, and they're not. And we shouldn't demonize them. I think they may be wrong about certain aspects. They might not be strong enough in terms of the rule of law as we would like them, but I think that they're sincere, and I don't think that they're Machiavellian in the sense that you've suggested. But the reverse is also true, that if you're one that believes in strong immigration laws and enforcement of immigration laws, those people shouldn't be demonized either. They're sincerely concerned about their borders, about their national sovereignty, about the rule of law, because of how important it is. And some of these people are the ones who came in through legitimate channels, took the time and the effort, and it is unfair to them who went to the legitimate channels to watch people come in illegally. And there is a certain injustice in that as well. And so they shouldn't be demonized just because they have these beliefs. But
apparently that's the state of mankind. You have perhaps the greatest instrument in the history of man, maybe the interaction on the internet, on social media, and discussion. And it devolves mostly into name calling, in making fun of the looks of the president, in making fun of his hairstyle, on both sides, right?
Yeah, sure.
So I mean, I don't.
Obama
Mhm.
was ridiculed. His wife was
Right,
ridiculed.
right. Her appearance was ridiculed.
I mean,
Your attractiveness, etc. I mean, how childish is this? But that's where we're at. And similarly, the news media. How many? The news media is very politicized too now, isn't it?
I think it is. I think everybody recognizes that.
Whether it's Fox or CNN, etc. Well, we've been talking about the Latin Mass, and you've been talking. Actually, there's another Catholic service that's unusual here. It's the Anglican. Are they still doing the Anglican Mass?
They were winding that down. I don't know if it's still around. Yeah, they had the Anglican use, part of the Ordinariate, which was a group that I think under John Paul II and then Benedict XVI allowed for people who were Episcopalian and married priests to come over and become Catholic under the headship of a particular bishop, separate apart from the diocesan bishop. And we used to have a group here, but they were phasing that down.
I was unaware of that. I was very impressed when I go into the Anglican Mass.
They
I was very impressed by the ceremony, and the solemnity, and the devoutness of that.
Yeah.
Of that. So we may not have that. We still have the Latin Mass. You have the Novus Ordo. There are Eastern rites too. I don't know if you have any of those here.
I'm not aware of us having an Eastern.
No, I don't think
here.
we do. But there are other rites, correct?
Yes.
What are they?
There are many of them. But I guess there's
a Byzantine rite.
There's a Byzantine rite. There's a Uniate rite. I think there's a they use different services like the Liturgy of St. James, the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, and so forth. And then there's rites in the Middle East and so forth. So there's probably 40 different rites.
By the way, I'm looking at the timer because we have like six minutes left, and there's like how many different rites?
There's 40 or something. I've seen a chart. It's rather intricate. And you have rites, and then you have sub-rites or uses under that. Where you have the Syro-Malabar rite. You have the Maronite rite. There's so many of them. I don't know them all.
Well, there is an Eastern branch of Catholicism too, correct?
Correct.
And what's that called?
They call them the Uniate Church. They have the same liturgy as the Eastern Orthodox, either Russian or Greek, but they recognize the headship of the Pope.
And their priests are allowed to get married, correct?
They have, similar to the Greek Orthodox Church, their priests are married. Their bishops come from the monastic orders, and so the bishops are not married. Some
Greek woman I know states that the only reason the Catholics have that Byzantine rite is to compete with the Orthodox and to eliminate Orthodox membership. I don't know. I always think I'm one of those people that find something like that funny, because there's a view on everything, right? And I don't know. It could be. I never studied that.
Well, look, the actual ceremonies of the Eastern Orthodox were being done when the church was together. I mean, they stemmed before the 1000 AD, right? So there's absolutely nothing wrong with the rites themselves. They can be fully incorporated into the Catholic Church. The big distinction, there's some doctrinal ones, but the big distinction is a juridical one, which is what role does the Pope have in terms of the governance of the universal church? The Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox and the different Orthodox churches reject the headship of the Pope. And that's really the biggest single. And now
many Catholics are very disappointed in Pope Francis. And I've had discussions with my brother stating, well, maybe in the long run, the Orthodox organizational structure is superior, because if you have, it doesn't rely upon one person's in a kind of whatever patriarchal or monarchical situation where there's one leader.
Well, yes, but they don't have one leader, so they also get into squabbles.
No, they don't. They have many, but they don't seem to have had the.
And you don't have a right to appeal anywhere ultimately, and the church should be one, Christians should be one, and so you have to have almost a divinely appointed headship. And Peter's the only one that seems to me that had it in the scriptures, and so the successor of Peter's legitimately are the ones that should be looked at. And the Greek Orthodox recognize them as being a first among equals, but they don't recognize his jurisdictional authority over every single diocese, every single parish,
What
if he
ye-
wishes to exercise it.
What was the year of, I think they refer to it sometimes as a great schism between Orthodoxy and Catholicism? What year was that?
I think it's 1054 AD, if I'm right, but I don't know.
And you know what? If you want to read, it's funny. Again, this is my sense of humor. The Orthodox blame the Catholics, and the Catholics blame the Orthodox for that schism.
Absolutely, that's true.
That's true. This is the end of our show. I want to thank anybody who was watching, whether it was Eric Rodriguez, Danny Nola, Diana Hermanson Lang, Joe Benavides, Judge Joe Benavides, Mercy Rojas. Thank you for watching. We're gonna dress this show up, show it in public access, and be broadcast on YouTube and on Facebook. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.